This is video 2 of IAS 20, Accounting for Government Grants and Disclosure of Government Assistance, as well as SIG 10. In this video, we will be looking at the definitions, as well as we will be starting with the recognition criteria of government grants. So what are we looking at if we refer to the government? In terms of IAS 20, we say the government is the government agencies, as well as similar bodies. And then very importantly, it can be local, national, or an international government. So it does not need to be your own government from which you receive this grant. Now the definition of government grant. Okay, so we have the government. The government transfers resources with certain conditions attached to them to the entity. But this needs to relate to the operating activities of the entity. Then as well, SIG 10 has certain rules relating to the operating activities, which we will be looking at in the next slide. So, we have the government that transfers resources with conditions attached to them to the entity that must relate to the operating activities of the entity. Okay. Then IAS 20 has certain exclusions from this definition, which you will have to study. It says it excludes government assistance with no value to be placed on it, and it also excludes transactions with government which can't be distinguished from normal trading. This is, for example, if the entity is a manufacturer of paper, okay, and it sells this paper to the government. This is a normal trading transaction, and it is not a government grant. Okay, so let's just look at the whole definition again. We have the government that transfers resources with certain conditions attached to them to the entity that must relate to the operating activities of the entity. This is a very important definition for you guys to learn in IAS 20. Okay, so this has to do with what if conditions to receive such assistance may not be specifically related to the operating activities of the entity. Remember, one of the requirements of the IAS 20 definition of government grant is that it must relate to the entity's operating activities. Now the question is, what if it doesn't? So it rather relates to the industry or the area in which the entity operates. Is this still a government grant or not? SIG 10 answers this question for us, and it tells us that it remains a government grant. So, what we have in SIG 10 is that what if the grant does not relate to the operating activities of the entity, but rather to the industry or area? Then SIG 10 says it remains a government grant in terms of IAS 20. Thus far, we've already looked at the background as well as the scope. And now in this video, we've looked at the definitions as well as SIG 10. And now we will be starting to look at the recognition criteria of government grants. The recognition criteria of government grants. So when do we recognize this grant? Paragraph 7 and 8 gives us the guidance. Okay. Government grants, including non-monetary grants at fair value, shall not be recognized until there is a reasonable assurance that. So here are two criteria, and remember it's and criteria, so you have to meet both requirements. Okay. So we need to be reasonably sure that the entity will comply with the conditions and that the grant will be received. Okay, very important. Then when a grant is received, it does not mean that the entity will comply with the conditions. Okay, so when you receive a grant, you did not comply with the requirement that the entity has reasonable assurance that the entity will comply with the conditions. Therefore, you did not meet both criteria and you can't recognize a government grant in terms of IAS 20. Now, as we continue with the recognition of grants, IAS 20 tells us that the manner in which a grant is received does not affect the accounting. For example, if you receive cash and whether you receive a reduction in a loan, it does not affect the accounting. Then, as we know, there might be uncertainty. If there is uncertainty about the compliance with the conditions, then we raise a liability. Okay, in other words, we did not meet the recognition criteria. Okay, then we do not recognize a government grant, but we did have money we received, for example, debit bank. Now we need to credit something. Now we're just crediting a liability. We do not recognize a government grant. Then if there are any contingent liabilities or assets arising from the grant, you will treat it in terms of IAS 37, which you will do in your IAS 37 lecture.